What's up, Internet? We are here with more awesome loot. Jazz hands. This time, of course, because it is the end of summer, we are doing stuff primarily related to stuff I got over the summer and garage sales. Yeah! Side note, there weren't really any garage sales with games, because living in this town is kind of crap when it comes to getting retro games, and that really sucks, but I did find one thing. So I guess we're kind of starting with the miscellaneous stuff just to get there, so, you know, you're going to scrub through and skip all this or just leave the video already. I get it. But there are actual games coming. But we're going to start with the first thing I got at garage sales, which is the only thing, and I got it because it looked really interesting. This is too big for my camera. But this is Bloxel's Build Your Own Video Games. I saw this at a yard sale and I got it for $1. And this is basically rudimentary video game development tools for children who are physical learners. And I thought this was a really neat idea. The idea is you get this plastic board and these little cubes that represent individual elements to the thing. Like you can see on the thing, there's like a character over here, and that represented by the purple thing there. Coins are represented by yellow, and that you can make your own custom sprites and stuff. It's a very interesting idea. As someone who has worked with game development tools before, I can tell you that this would be incredibly wildly inefficient, but if you are a physical learner and you wanted to try and figure out how video game development works in some way that's really on your level, this would be perfect for you. And I thought, if nothing else, it's a strange thing and it might be worth making a video on at some point. So, you know, I grabbed it thinking it was pretty interesting. But that's really the only thing I got at garage sales this year, because there really weren't anything there that was really video game related. I did see a copy of Mario Jenga, but it was missing half the pieces, and I don't have anyone to play board games with. So alas, that's the extent of garage sale finds. I do have a couple other miscellaneous things, mostly virtual pets though. Because I started collecting them last year because I don't really have a ton of history with virtual pets. I did grow up in the time and I got like a knockoff Gigapet after the fad, but it was at that point that all the schools banned them, so I never even got to really play with it, and then like the battery died instantly and we lost the back to it and we just never replaced it. So I could never actually play with it or use it. So last year I got into collecting virtual pets, and this year I collected a few more because they were cheap, starting with a Digimon version 20th. These are a bit of a downgrade considering that I started with the Digimon X version 2, but these are available in English, and if you are interested in the old school Digimon toys, these are effectively a collection of 5 in 1. You get all 5 versions of the original Digimon toy, which North America originally only got 2 versions, so there's a huge upgrade to this. Unfortunately, if you compare this to the Digimon X2, which is what I started with, it's just substantially less content and substantially less interesting. Like, this has 5 different eggs from those different things, plus I believe there's like 4 you can unlock, plus each variation of this device gets an additional like special egg, but the only way to get it is to connect with 5 other completely unique devices, so you'll never get them. So I just picked the glow-in-the-dark one. But while that means that there's like a grand total of something like 75-80 monsters on this, compared to the Digimon X's, I think mine had like 45 on it. That was 45 that were created by 1 egg, and it was like a giant spiderweb evolution path where you could make basically anything from anywhere, and it was a huge, interesting thing. There was tons of unlockables, a whole RPG mode. I actually wouldn't mind trying to review that at some point, but this is very rudimentary. You've got like 75 monsters, but they come from 5 eggs, so each egg can only have like maybe 10 or 15 monsters attached to it. It's actually very, very linear and kind of boring and not that interesting. The only thing this has really added over the original Digimon toys is that it had fusions added and 1 or 2 extra monsters that they didn't have originally, but that's kind of it. And honestly, overall, I just found it to be a very, very boring device compared to the Digimon X. But that said, both are available in English. I think they even sell them directly at GameStop. They're very, very cheap. I got this on Amazon for $10, and it was an interesting little V-Pet to pick up for basically nothing. Next we have a Digimon X version 1, or the A variation. This is a bit of a downgrade from the X2, which is what I have, and it's still an upgrade to the Digimon 20th over here, in that it still has the RPG mode and a lot of unlockables, but it has about half as many monsters as the Digimon X2, half as much unlockables, and just in general, I do not enjoy the roster to this all that much. But that said, I bought this because I saw it on eBay and someone was selling it for $2, and they saw that I looked at their ad and they offered me $1.50, and I offered them $1 and they said yes. So I played this. I even painted it, added this gold panel lining, so this isn't a completely base thing. And it was fun. Aside from the fact that the giant red X makes this look a little bit too busy, I think the paint job I did looks nice, and it was fun to play with, and it's something I can put in my little V-Pet collection, put in my background for my videos, so that's kind of cool. And it was $1, so, you know, it's hard to go wrong with something that low price point. This, however, did not cost $1. This is a Pendulum Z2. This cost substantially more than $1. These are pretty expensive and hard to find. This is like the second variation Pendulum Z, but it's an interesting idea. It's called Pendulum if you're not familiar because it has a little clacky pendulum counter in it. But those are no longer used in these. Instead, that's just for a tactile feedback thing. Instead, it has a pendulum counter. That's what they removed. It has a accelerometer in it that is kind of sort of okay. It's not great. Honestly, I bought this because I had recently bought my first vehicle because my grandmother's rather sick, and I figure if I have an emergency vehicle just to go see her in case something's necessary, that would be great. I bought myself a motorcycle. It's very cool. I quite like it. And I had a key. Let's get something with a keychain. My other things with keychains would never do. Let's use this as an excuse to buy a Pendulum Z2. But the thing about the Pendulum Z2 that I don't necessarily like, it does sort of have a similar adventure mode to the Digimon X's. It doesn't have that many monsters, and I don't think any of the devices really have a desirable, absolutely necessary roster of monsters. Like, I usually like to go for the robots and the villain characters because they're just so much more interesting to me, you know, like Machine Dramon, Lady Devimon, Bellstar. I like the villain characters. They're just more interesting to me. And none of the Pendulum Zs really have that, even though they do have a, well, this one's the machine designated device, but there's also a villain designated device, and they don't really seem to have all that many standout characters, or even really like the sort of signature ones of the series. In addition, they have like this weird tie-in with, what was at the time, the movie that came out, Last Evolution Kizuna, I believe, where if you connect these devices with other devices, you'd unlock special monsters. So for the version 1.0s, you'd get Taichi's Agumon. For the version 2s like this, you'd get Yamato's Gabumon. And the thing is, if you unlock them, they would take precedence over everything else. Like, all those evolutions were just easier to get and were designed to be the thing you'd get by default as opposed to the things that actually appear on here. So you would actually kind of hamper the device's like special, like, signature monsters for a tie-in that you might not necessarily even want. So you'd have to avoid playing with other people if you could find other people. These are Japanese exclusive, of course, unlike these two. But it's interesting, and I wanted to get a Pendulum device because I thought they were neat. But I don't think this was worth it, and they were very, very expensive. But it gave me an excuse to put something with my key on it, so there's that. For the last device we have, this is a little bit different. I figured, you know, we've had the sort of Tamagotchi for boys in the form of Digimon, but I've never had a proper Tamagotchi device, so I decided to fix that with a Tamagotchi Meets device. This is apparently a limited edition color. I got this off Yahoo Auctions Japan for super, super cheap, and it's pretty interesting because I'm not super familiar with the actual Tamagotchi toys. This one was recommended to me because a lot of people seem to think this is like the best Tamagotchi toy. It has like a bunch of unlockable areas. What's really cool is your Tamagotchi, as it levels, if I can, I can't see my little history, but I can look at my Tamagotchi, so that's my current Tamagotchi. If I can zoom in, she's half witch and half genie, and she's very, very, very cool. But she's sad because she's currently with her parents. one is a pumpkin. And now she's happy. These devices are really neat because they have sort of a genetics system. So your Tamagotchi grows over the course of about 2 days and becomes an adult. Your first Tamagotchi is the generic one that all the games have always had, all the way back to the originals. And once you finally become an adult, you can find another adult and you can propose to them, either an NPC or another player character, and you'll get an egg that mixes the genetics of both player characters. And I think that is genuinely quite cool. I'm currently on the, I believe, 10th generation of Tamagotchi here, and I just think it's interesting and quite engaging. There's a new one that came out that looks pretty neat, but it removed the genetics feature, which is honestly one of the coolest things this device has. But yeah, this was my first real Tamagotchi. I have the Game Boy game. I hate it. I want to review it at some point just because I hate it so much, but this was neat. This was neat, and I had a lot of fun with it. Alright, next we have not one, but two new games that came out this year. First we have Legend of Zelda, Tears of the Kingdom. This is basically Breath of the Wild 2. And I never liked Breath of the Wild. And I hate this game. It does do some things that I think are better than Breath of the Wild. For one thing, its dungeons feel a little bit more like dungeons to me, but not substantially. And like Breath of the Wild, most of the game is pretty much unrewarding. Like, they can't give you any particularly good rewards outside of costume pieces, and those are very, very limited. Weapons still have the weapon durability issue that they've always had that has made me hate Breath of the Wild, and most of the content just feels like filler. So yeah, it's basically the same thing. Also, they crammed Banjo-Kazooie nuts and bolts mechanics in for some reason, so you can make your own Lego cars. But it's not interesting or fun, it's just as much of a distraction as the previous one. On the bright side, I think the fact that this game is basically just another Breath of the Wild is making people retroactively go back and look at Breath of the Wild and realize it really wasn't that good a game, like at all. Breath of the Wild sucked, and this isn't much better. Next we have a game I actually did like, which is Pikmin 4, or as I like to call it, the Pikmin 3 we should have gotten because Pikmin 3 was terrible. This is actually quite good, although it's confusing because they kind of retcon the plot of the first game for weird reasons. So now that Ulmer has a dog and suddenly he becomes a Pikmin himself, like the bad ending. So I think the other Pikmin games are now non-canonical or something. There are some things about this game I don't like. I don't particularly like that there are versus battles in the single-player campaign, and they split the screen, which doesn't do anything for that single-player experience, really. I didn't really care for the fact that they kind of reworked the entire core premise of Pikmin, where, you know, you're not supposed to be on the ground at night because it's so hostile, except that you have a base camp that stays on ground at the night, and it's completely safe. And also you have to go out and adventure at night, which is interesting, but it's really just very, very weak defensive missions. But on the bright side, you do get cool ghost Pikmin, and those might be some of my favorite Pikmin of all time, right up there with the white Pikmin and little pink Pikmins. I like the small, goofy ones. But it is adventuring, and it is treasure hunting, not unlike Pikmin 3, where you're picking up, like, identical fruits. And they got rid of the time limit, which is nice, because I hated that. The only other things I don't necessarily like about this is in the overworld, when things die, they stay dead. So once you clear out all the monsters, they're just kind of gone forever. And they brought back the water wraith, which is the worst thing ever in Pikmin 2. But at least they brought the treasure hunting back and made it kind of meaningful, and in a way that really sort of works for the narrative. And, you know, Pikmin 4, this one was actually a nice hit for Nintendo, as opposed to the, like, bizarre quantity over quality of Tears of the Kingdom, Mario Odyssey, Breath of the Wild. Like, Nintendo's been making a lot of weird choices with their games that just don't resonate with me at all. Pikmin 4 was actually pretty solid, though. So we are back, probably with the thing you actually care about in all this. I like virtual pets anyway. Either way, at the start of the year, I kind of aspired to focus primarily collecting on PS1 and Genesis this year, and while I've mostly kind of skipped out on PS1, I have collected a fair few Genesis games. In fact, the list I have of games I want to get is at about 25 more titles right now, and 15 of those titles or so are all, like, unaffordably expensive, so I will probably never get Crusader, Senti, or Musha, but there's about 10 or so more Genesis games I'd like to get, and I think I've done a pretty admirable job of making my Genesis collection pretty good this year. In that regard, I have not one, not two, but 18 Genesis games I've collected over this summer to show you that I think are going to help make my Genesis collection a lot better. If you know anything about the Genesis collection, please tell me I did good. I think I did good, but I always have buyer's remorse even when I get the things I want because I have zero self-confidence. Anyway, we're starting this off with a fairly obscure platformer. We've got High Seas Havoc. This is a game I would kind of describe as off-brand Bubsy a little bit. This is kind of a weird game. It is a very, very difficult platformer that has a lot of like bespoke cute animations if you get hurt, but you don't die instantly, so it's instantly better than Bubsy. You play as this pirate seal who has to go fight a different pirate to collect an emerald to save the world or something. It's a very, very difficult game though. I played this for about an hour on stream, and I guess I was playing on the easy mode or something because the game actually stopped me after level 3 and said play on a harder difficulty, but I was dying left, right, and center. It was a very, very difficult game. It does not help that this game uses Sonic-style momentum, but it's built vertically, kind of like Bubsy, where the levels are more Mario designed, but the mechanics are more Sonic-style and they just don't gel quite right. It also does not help that your only attack is a jump kick. Like, you can jump on stuff and you can jump kick and that's your lot, so if an enemy attacks you on the ground, you have no way of really dealing with that. There are a few issues with this game, but I think it's pretty interesting. And to be fair, this is, I think, the last affordable one on eBay. Like, I saw this for about $50 and I said, well, that's a game I did want to collect, so I grabbed it. And there aren't many other copies on there, but like the next cheapest one was like $250, so I think I did okay grabbing this when I did, because otherwise I might not have been able to. Our next game is a game I never thought I'd get a hold of, but we have Mega Turrican. I am not super well versed in Turrican. I know it's by Factor 5, I know Chris Hulsbeck did the soundtrack, and I know a lot of people like to call it like arcadey Metroid because you have a super armored guy who has basically a morph ball, but you also get a grappling hook in this game, a bunch of different guns. It's a pretty fun game, very, very difficult, but I do quite like it. And the Turrican games are really hard to find because of course Factor 5 went under and even their digital copies have just disappeared, although there is a Turrican collection now that I don't think contains this game. I think this is like the one Turrican game that it does not contain, but I'm glad I got this. I did want to start collecting Turrican because I think it's an interesting series, but I have no experience with it, and it's very, very hard to collect for as well. But it is a very, very fun action run and gun type game. It's definitely a game worth collecting if you can get it affordably, but that's the trick, isn't it? Either way, I'm glad I got it, and I'm glad that I got to start collecting for Turrican, because that's a series that I've always had a fascination with. Next we have a game that to me felt like a total whiff. We have Shadowrun on the Genesis. I also have the Super Nintendo Shadowrun, but that's a very different game. They have the same name because it's based off a tabletop game, but whereas the Super Nintendo one was a very personal RPG telling a story that was kind of a point and click, kind of a almost sort of noir mystery from what I remember. It was very convoluted and it was a little bit hard to play because the controls were very, very clumsy and it felt like it was doing too much, but it was an ultimately fun game. This one, from what I played for like an hour, was basically just running around town, doing errands, picking up a character at X spot, dropping them off at Y location, rinse and repeat so you make money. It's weird that it starts off with a grind, and when I finally got out of there, I had no idea where I was going. It just was not gripping me half as much as the Super Nintendo one was. It's a game I probably need to spend a lot more time with, but it's not a game that hit me immediately. This one feels like it starts off on the worst foot possible, and it might not get better. But it was an RPG on the Sega Genesis, and I do want to collect them all, so I kind of had to grab it at some point. Alright, next we have a game I did not actively try and get, but it was a $5, so why not? We have Echo the Dolphin. This game is notorious for me. Back in the day, in the elementary school I went to, everyone with a Genesis seemed to play this, and I was the only one who seemed to be able to figure out how to get out of the tutorial. It's sort of like that one drum in Sonic 3 that always kills someone once, at least, that no one just seems to know how to get past. Also, side note, you just press up and down and the barrel goes up and down. You can go past it super easy. But it's dumb that they don't explain that. Here, the tutorial just got people so walled that they never even got to start the game. And the tutorial is pretty simple. You just jump in the air. That's it. But Echo the Dolphin's kind of a weird game as well. You play as a dolphin, so you're a mammal and you need to breathe. But the entire game is underwater. And if I remember correctly, it turns into like a weird Geiger nightmare, from what I remember. The sequel does as well. It's a very weirdly toned game because it starts as like this cute little dolphin game, hey, and it's like, why am I fighting aliens? Why is everything scary all of a sudden? Weird series. Might be worth talking about at some point, but I don't really have that much of a connection outside of the fact that no one seemed to know how to beat the tutorial back in the day. Following that up, we have Echo 2, Tides of Time. I don't remember specifically playing this game, but I had Echo 1 here, so I figured I'd grab this as well. It was super cheap, again, $5, and like I said, it's a weird Geiger nightmare that starts off not like that. I don't understand the idea and tone of the Echo games. It's just a bizarre thing to me. There is one other Echo game on the Genesis I don't have. It's called Echo Junior, and it has no air meter because for some reason dolphins can just breathe underwater now. But it's also a kid's game, whereas these are actually supposed to be like harder, I guess. But this was one of those Genesis games that's sort of indicative of the system. It was a signature of the system, so I thought I'd grab it. It was cheap, and I had the other one, so why not? Following that up, we have another game that's a signature of the system. We have Vector Man. I have a lot of history with Vector Man. I loved Vector Man. When I was in junior high, every Friday night I'd go to the store, grab a Coke Slurpee, grab a bag of beef jerky, and I would just play Vector Man. And it just became like a weekly tradition for me, and I got so good at playing Vector Man that like I was basically speedrunning it before speedrunning was a thing, because I think that was before Radix did his Metroid Prime run, which was kind of the first speedrun that wasn't just replaying demos of Quake. But this was a game that I really, really enjoyed a lot. I remember renting this when this first came out, and there was I believe it was like $10,000 grand prize for beating this game and like submitting a photo of the final screen to the developers. And I remember taking on that challenge with someone I knew, and we had just beaten it because it's a pretty long and somewhat difficult game. And we apparently had submitted like a day after the prize had been claimed. So we just missed it by that much. But I remember the first level being kind of a bit of a trick too, because when I was a kid, I couldn't beat the first level myself because the boss is like this giant plane. And I thought the giant plane was like a giant hurt box, but it's not. It's just like two little balls it has stuck to its wings that you can just jump over. So that I lost that, but that's why I had to play with someone else to beat that level for me. But I love Vector Man. I think this game is great. Fantastic, super cheap. I got this for about $10, and it was a game on the Genesis I have a connection to. I did want to collect. Following that up, we have Vector Man 2. I don't have as much of a connection to this game as Vector Man 1. Like I said, I used to play a lot of Vector Man 1 to the point where I was basically speedrunning it before speedrunning was even a thing. And when you have that much time afterwards and you already have Vector Man on lock anyway, why not start playing Vector Man 2? And this one just didn't hit as much for me. I think the reason is a couple, though, because first of all, Vector Man was fighting a bunch of robots, whereas in Vector Man 2 you're fighting a bunch of bugs for some reason. I don't even think you're on the Earth anymore. You are, like, Vector Man is a garbage spaceship pilot, and he gets shot down over a planet. They don't specify which planet, but you don't see any other robots, and the Earth has been trashed by, you know, humans, which have left robots to clean it up, and there doesn't seem to be robots, so you're not on the same planet, I imagine. But yeah, the fighting bugs thing never really clicked with me. The final boss is, from what I remember, a giant spider in the background that you just have to shoot the face of. There didn't seem like as many transformations in this game, although it did have a transformation where you turned into both a tank and a rhino, which I thought was pretty cool. there was a lot less variable levels as well. Like Vector Man 1 started with side-scrolling run and gun, then it was a top-down game, then it did side-scrolling run and gun for a couple more levels, and then it had like a top-down sort of Frogger Pac-Man kind of level from what I remember. This one, it's pretty much exclusively side-scrolling platforming, and that's the strength of the series as well, but I think when you take away the variability of Vector Man, you don't really have much going on with Vector Man, unfortunately. But yeah, it's probably a fine game, but it just didn't grab me half as much as Vector Man 1 did. But Vector Man 2, it's cheap and it was okay. Next we have a game that really interested me. We have Ranger X. This is a game that is kind of run and gun, kind of shmuppy. It reminds me a little bit of Choplifter, even though it has basically nothing to do with Choplifter. Basically, you play as this robot and his little motorcycle that he gets to ride, and you can detach from the motorcycle and it'll like work autonomously with you, and then suddenly it becomes a platformer. It's hard to describe Ranger X, but it's a very neat game, and I had a lot of people tell me this was a great game, and I did want to pick this up, and it's got a cool robot, so I gotta have it, you know? But I did pick this up for fairly cheap, and I'm glad I did. It's definitely one of the more interesting Genesis titles out there, I think, and it's totally worth picking up. Alright, next we have Shadow Dancer, The Secret of Shinobi. This was, I think, like the third or fourth Shinobi game, because there was like Shinobi, Alex Kidd Shinobi, if you count that, Cyber Shinobi, I think there was GG Shinobi as well at one point. There's a lot of Shinobi games. But this was kind of the second Shinobi game as like directly billed by the first game. And it makes sense because it plays a lot like it, but you get a dog that follows you around, and that's the thing that really clicked with me. Because honestly, Shinobi's a perfectly fine game, but I didn't like the whole rescuing hostages, disarming bombs thing like that. I wasn't interested in that. I just want to be a ninja running around hacking and slashing people. And this is more of the first game, but with a dog, which is better, but it's still not quite my Shinobi, you know? Not a bad game, though. Better than the first one, I'll say that much. But now, we actually have My Shinobi with Shinobi 3, Return of the Ninja Master. This is just straight up platforming execution challenges, hacking, slashing, throwing shurikens, beating bosses, and being awesome. This is the Shinobi game I really like, and it is an absolute blast to play. It's also kind of hard to find. Fortunately, I found someone selling it for relatively cheap, and I'm glad I've got this. This was definitely one I needed to get a hold of, and I'm glad I do have it. I would like to talk about this game more in the future, but I do think this is probably the best Genesis Shinobi game out of all of them. And it's just a lot of really intense action packed into one cartridge. It's very, very good. Alright, next we have a game I was surprised was as expensive as it was, because the fact is, like, Genesis prices in general are universally rising, but this was on several Genesis collections from what I remember, so I figured it would be more affordable than it was. That game is Beyond Oasis. This was a very, very, very late Genesis game. It has some really beautiful visuals and audio, and it's kind of a top-down adventure RPG. I think a lot of people would compare it to Zelda, but those in the know would probably more accurately compare it to Brainlord, because this game is all about having little familiar fairies and stuff following you around, solving all your problems for you. And it does it in an interesting sort of resource managey way, whereas, you know, Brainlord, it's just you had your fairies out at all times doing whatever you needed them to do. Here they are running off a magic meter that is powered by not using them effectively, so you have to know when to use them, when to not, and so you can summon them when you need them. But you summon them by firing your magic gauntlet at various elements, and the elements that the spirits correspond to then summon them. So like if you see a water spout or something, you can summon the water character. If you see fire, you can summon the fire character. Very, very neat game. It's not super long, but it's a lot of fun, and I just have a weird history with this, because, like I said, I remember this being on a lot of Sega compilations, and I would play this game pretty frequently, and I'd be like, oh, this game is beautiful, this game sounds great, it's awesome, aside from the fact that weapons break, because weapon durability is the worst thing ever. But I remember I'd always like play up to the first boss, absolutely love this game, say, yeah, I can't wait to play more of this game, and then just stop. I would always just get to the first boss, have an absolute ball, and then stop. This time I at least beat the second boss. I've been playing this a little bit on my own time, and it's a lot of fun. I also have the sequel, which is a game called Legend of Oasis that's on the Sega Saturn. And that's a pretty cool game too, but this is a genuinely very impressive Genesis game. It's really hard to find, really expensive. But I am glad I got this because, again, I am trying to collect all the RPGs for the system, and I'm getting close. I think I'm missing like 3 at this point, if we don't count stuff that's also on the Super Nintendo. And that's got me pretty pumped. Alright, our next 2 games have kind of a couple things in common. For one thing, they were both made by Konami back when what they made was worth a squirt of piss. Second of all, they were games that had sort of analogous games also on the Super Nintendo, and if I may be a bit heretical here to say this, I think the Genesis games were better. So let's talk about this. These are hard to find games that I got for a ridiculous deal, starting with Contra Hard Corps. Now, I have played Contra 3 The Alien Wars, and that is a perfectly fine game, but it feels very, very safe. It feels like the most baseline Contra game you could ever play. Contra Hard Corps, to me, is what Contra 3 should have been. You have 4 different playable characters that each have completely different weapon sets, so they all play and move differently. They have different hitboxes. They all play functionally very, very differently. You have splitting paths, which give you different levels, as well as different story beats and endings, depending on the paths you choose. And you even get bits of like Mode 7 on the Genesis. It's very, very impressive. This is a ridiculously good Contra game, and while the first game I think is probably the most iconic and classic, this one might be the best. Well, the DS one's also really good, but Contra Hard Corps, surprisingly legit, and this game goes for a fair bit of money, but like I just ran into a situation where someone was trying to sell this, and they couldn't. Like, they relisted it 4 or 5 times, and they just decided to give me, like, a ridiculous deal on it, so I ended up buying this for less than half what it normally goes for, which, you know, I'm quite happy with, because this was one I definitely wanted to get a hold of. The only issue is the North American version is substantially harder than the Japanese version, because the Japanese version, you're supposed to have, like, 3 hit points and unlimited continues, from what I remember. North American one, you get 1 continue, 0 hit points. You are one shot, you are dead, because they decided to make this as hard as the older Contra games so that you couldn't beat it in one rental sitting. Like, they just decided, you know, for the Western releases, we're going to make this harder, so if you rent the game, you're going to have to rent it a few times. And if you buy it, well, you're going to have a hard time, but you'll probably have a fun time. Great game, unbelievably hard, though. Very, very good game. Following that up, we have Castlevania Bloodlines. This game is very, very cool, and well, I did say that I think the Genesis versions are better than the Super Nintendo versions. I guess I have to put an asterisk next to that, because that's assuming that we're talking about Super Castlevania 4, because I like Dracula X a whole lot. Yes, it's not Rondo, don't jump down my throat about it not being Rondo. Everyone does it, I don't get why. But Dracula X is very, very good. This is better than Super Castlevania 4, though. It's a lot more of a traditional Castlevania game. It's a lot stiffer moving, which a lot of people would normally associate with a bad thing, but having played Castlevania 4 with your whip that can basically deflect from any angle at all times, it's just way too bloody easy. This game is a lot harder. You've got 2 different playable characters, which each play differently. You've got the whip guy, as well as what's his name, Eric Lacarde, which might be an Alucard reference, but better because naming your character Dracula spelled backwards isn't that clever. And yes, I know Son of Dracula did it. It wasn't clever then either. But each character has a different weapon. You've got one with a whip and the other with a spear who will impale himself if he dies, which is kind of grim. And I just remember this game having a really cool effect. I believe it's on the final level, but you'll run to a point where the stages are like horizontally segmented in 5 different segments, and they don't track. So like, if you jump up here, you might like pass a horizontal bar right about here, and then suddenly you'd be over here, and then you jump to like the top segment and you'd be like right here. Like, it's hard to explain, but they basically segmented it horizontally, and the location of where you are on the screen doesn't correspond to where you go when you pass those lines. I've never known how they programmed that, and I would love to. Like, that is possibly the coolest effect that Genesis has ever had, and it just floors me every time I see it. This game does a lot of really cool things as well. It does some 3D effects. Again, sort of Mode 7-y stuff on the Genesis. Konami was really on their A game when they made these, which, again, it feels like they were kind of coasting on the Super Nintendo a fair bit, whereas it felt like they were trying to prove something on the Genesis. These games are absolutely awesome. And like Contra, this was one of those games that goes for an awful lot of money that I saw an auction for that was like, it was ending at 4 in the morning. And since I'm up streaming at that time normally anyway, I was up looking at this and like no one had bid on it. So I got minimum bid, which was less than half what this normally goes for, which is nice because it's rare, it's expensive, and it's a game I've really wanted. Everyone tells me it's great. And yeah, it's pretty great. I liked Castlevania Bloodlines a fair bit. Alright, next we have a bit of a anomaly, because this is a game by Capcom of all people that's actually pretty obscure, and I can only think of one other obscure Capcom game, and that's Gotcha Force, one of my favorite games of all time. The game we have here is a game called Cheeky Cheeky Boys, although it might also be called Mega Twins. It's weird because sometimes it goes by like the weird Japanese arcade game name, sometimes it goes with the weird North American name, but I just call it Capcom branded Wonder Boy because that's basically what it is. It's sort of like Wonder Boy in Monster World, but by Capcom, and that's awesome because I do like the Wonder Boy games a fair bit. It's a bit of a difficult game, not because the levels themselves are particularly difficult or anything, but more so the fact that the game gives you, I think, 1 life and 0 continues, so when you die, you basically have to restart the game over and over again. I think this was more of a, so you couldn't beat it in one sitting, and because it's a port of an arcade game, they tried to maintain the arcade difficulty without adding modifiers to allow it to be more playable from a console experience. But I really like this game, and it's really obscure, and it's one of the harder to find games. It's not super expensive or anything. I think I paid $40 for this, but yeah, I really like this, and I think it's neat, and I'm glad I got this. This was one I wanted to make a point of getting. And if you like Wonder Boy, you might want to grab Cheeky Cheeky Boys because it's just sort of a weird, sort of tilted off-brand Wonder Boy, and that in and of itself is pretty neat to me. Alright, our next game is a game by Treasure, and it's an RPG, which works out great because I'm collecting those. We have Light Crusader. This is one of the weird, like, actually affordable games Treasure made. It's sort of a isometric adventure puzzle game. It's kind of like Solstice or Equinox, except you have a sword so you can actually, like, fight things, and you will need to do that a whole bunch. I wouldn't say this is a great game. I can see why this is probably not as well remembered or as desirable as Alien Soldier or Gunstar Heroes, but it's not a bad little RPG adventure game. It's kind of neat, it's fun to explore, and if you don't mind isometrics, you know, it's not a bad off-brand Equinox or Solstice, and I like both of those things. Side note, I really have to get a copy of Equinox at some point, but this game is quite cool, and again, I'm trying to collect like the RPGs and adventure games for the Genesis, because that's kind of my favorite genre. This was one I had to have, and I think it's quite good. I do quite like Light Crusader, but I totally get why it's not as well remembered or as fondly thought of as, say, good old Gunstar Heroes. So next we have something for the folks across the pond, because this is not a Genesis game. It's a Mega Drive game, and it's a Mega Drive game because there is no Genesis version of this. We have Super Fantasy Zone. Now, Fantasy Zone 2, The Tears of Opa Opa, was the very first game I ever played. It was the very first game I ever owned. So I am quite in love with Fantasy Zone. I even own a little figure of Opa Opa. It's something I love quite dearly. A lot of people like to call this Fantasy Zone 3 because it feels like the third Fantasy Zone game, but that's not quite right. It's actually the 5th one, because between Fantasy Zone 2 and this, there was 2 other, like, Fantasy Zone games that weren't quite Fantasy Zone games. You had Fantasy Zone The Maze, which was sort of Pac-Man-y, and then you had Galactic Protectors, which was like, if I remember correctly, it was like an omnidirectional missile command of sorts. But this was like the return of Fantasy Zone, as it should be, and it was actually the last one too, which is sad, especially because we didn't get this game. And I love Fantasy Zone so bloody much. It's a incredibly beautiful little cute 'em up that is really bloody hard. You have a bunch of different traps and tricks in various stages that require you to buy specific items. Like, if I remember correctly, there's like an area where it's entirely pitch black, so you have to get like a flashlight to see where you're actually going. There's a level, if I remember correctly, where the ground is electrocuted, so you need to buy rubber boots to stand in it. It's neat that they tried to come up with like different equipment and stuff to outfit your little ship with. I liked that a lot. The thing I didn't like so much was that this was structured far more closely to the original Fantasy Zone than Fantasy Zone 2. In Fantasy Zone 1, all of the combat in the world takes place on a single strip that loops around. Once you defeat all the enemy bases, then the boss shows up. Fantasy Zone 2, every stage was 3 different strips, and the boss doesn't show up. You have to find the boss door after you destroy all the bases, which meant that if you weren't ready to go fight the boss, or you just wanted to explore or prepare for it, you had the opportunity to. Whereas in this one, once you defeat the final base, the boss spawns. And I never liked that. That's the one thing about this that really doesn't work for me, I think. But that said, I'm a big fan of Fantasy Zone, so having this is a big deal to me. It's nice to finally be able to explore this game proper, and I'm just glad I got it. This was a huge surprise to me that I got this, because I didn't think I'd be able to find a copy or afford it, and I just happened to find one that was really affordable, so I'm glad I did. And this is not in shot, so I'm going to move this down here. Alright, so next we have Phantasy Star 3, Generations of Doom. This is a generational RPG. It's sort of like the JoJo of RPGs, where at the end of every character's, adventure, you have to get married, have an offspring, and then that offspring carries on to the next adventure. I haven't played a lot of this. I'm actually planning on reviewing this rather soon, because I just finished Phantasy Star 2 as a review. Still need to get a copy of that physically, but it's one of like the 3 RPGs I'm missing for the system. But I like this conceptually. As I understand, though, they kind of ran out of budget for this. Like, they couldn't fully realize their ambitions with this, because like they have 3 different generations, and like, as I understand, the final generation, it doesn't matter all that much who you marry, because the final chunk of the game is fairly similar across all generations, as I understand, which is a bit unfortunate. But to come up with an idea like that and to explore that is ambitious as all get out, especially at the time, Like, I can only think of one other game that did that, and that's Agarist War Zero, and that game was abysmally bad. So I'm interested in playing more of this. Although Dragon Quest V kind of did that a little bit too, but again, that was like one extra generation. There really wasn't all that much going on with it. This one feels a lot more ambitious, and I'm excited to explore it. And I happen to get a version that came with this big guidebook, which is cool, so I'll actually not get as lost, although it is horribly water damaged, so unfortunately a lot of the pages are stuck together, and if I try and remove them, they make crackling sounds, and sometimes it tears. But I should get less lost with this, so I'm pretty excited about that. I will say that. Now, that would be everything, except that today happened, and there was a bit of a surprise. See, I went to this little place where I get a little bit of side work so I can help pay for my rent. Side note, if you want to help support the show, do it through the Patreon. That way I can afford more games and pay rent, because that's kind of important. But anyway, I went to this local Goodwill, because sometimes they have like anime DVDs for like $1 or something. And as I was entering the place, I saw this lady leaving the place, and she had a Japanese import copy of Federation vs. Zeon. Which makes me kind of sad, because had I been there a few minutes earlier, I could have picked up a Japanese import Gundam game that, granted, I already own the English version of, but still I would have bought it. But that was an interesting indicator, because I guess someone had sold a bunch of retro gaming stuff there. So I actually picked up some really interesting stuff here. Let's search through my bag and pull out what I got. Starting with Genji Days of the Blade. This is the historical Japanese adventure where it is completely accurate to, history, including the giant enemy crabs you have to flip over for massive damage. This was a launch title for the PlayStation 3, and I don't think it was super well received, but it was a game I always wanted. And it says it was $3, but it was a blue tag day, so it was actually $1.50. So, I'm not going to say no to that. That's not too bad, even if it's not that great a game. Following that up, we have a game I actually already own and I reviewed years ago, but it was for $3, and I figure it might be worth trading for, and I remember this being worth a fair bit of money a couple years ago. That is Rogue Galaxy. This game is... It's a good game, but it starts off on a great note, but immediately after that great note, it sucks for like 10 hours. Basically, this is an amazing RPG that has an amazing intro, but like the first proper chapter of it is just a slog of a stretching green forest where everything looks the same. The plot sort of falls flat on its face at that point, and you just have to wait for it to be over, and it is hard to get through that. But if you can get through that, you have an amazing space pirate adventure with an amazing voice cast, some really brilliant weaponry and characters. I like this game, provided I can finish the, first proper chapter of the game. That's the real stumbling block. If you can do that, you have an amazing game made by the people who made Dark Cloud that even has some of the same ideas Dark Cloud has and would later go on to have. Rogue Galaxy, very good game. Just really rough second chapter that makes it really hard to get into. Following that up, we have Hitman Contracts. Last summer, I bought the Hitman PS2 collection that came with the Kane and Lynch demo. That collection had one disc. You'll never guess which one it had, but it might rhyme with the Kane and Lynch demo, the one thing you didn't actually want from it. I love Hitman, so finding this for $3, worth it to me, and I can put that in my collection, so that's nice, I guess. There was also Hitman 2, ditto. I can put this in my collection now, which is nice, so I will. Now, for some reason, my Goodwill puts some of the video games in like their jewelry cabinet as opposed to like with the DVDs and stuff. It's kind of all over the place and it's a bit of a mess, and they rarely ever have retro games, so this was a big deal. It's kind of why I splurged there. But I went to their jewelry cabinet and I did see some pretty interesting things. They had some N64 things. They had a bunch of different consoles as well. They had like 2 Xbox 360s. They had a PS2. They had a Dreamcast, which would have been really cool to have, but they wanted way too much money for it. But they did have some games, mostly N64 stuff, and mostly stuff I already had, GoldenEye, Mario Kart, that sort of thing, not that interesting. They did have one game I didn't have. No, they had 2. They had Cruisin' World, which they wanted $40 for, which, good luck with that. The only cruising game I want is Exotica, and I won't pay more than $15. But they had this for a $5. Star Wars Episode 1 Racer. This is a pretty fun game. In fact, I played this on my N64 multi-cart recently and talked about how this wasn't really the best way to play this, seeing as there was an arcade version and a Dreamcast version, but for a $5, that's pretty cool. And this marks the completion of all the Star Wars games on the N64. I now own every single one of them, from the awful Star Wars Battle for Naboo, the incredibly bad Shadows of the Empire that everyone is very nostalgic for, but I can assure you is not a good game, to the incredibly good Rogue Squadron, which is the second greatest Star Wars game ever made, and this game is quite good as well. Honestly, I collected this just because I wanted to complete the set, and it was about, I think, $3 or $5. It was not very expensive, and just to finish that chunk of the collection, that made me happy. Alright, they had a couple of Super Nintendo games as well. They weren't necessarily great games. Part of me thinks they either have like a huge collection that someone sold all at once and they're just sort of piecemeally doling it out every couple of days and like refilling their stocks when like the pile runs down or something. Or maybe someone collected all the good stuff because they didn't have much that was all that quality. But next we have Frantic Flea. Now, Frantic Flea, I don't know much about, but it was $5, and I hear it's not that good, but again, it was $5, so why not? And it's a game I didn't have, so it's something I can talk about in the future. And apparently it was by 1996 Game Tech Incorporated. I've never heard of those poor people. Following that up, we have a game that I know is pretty bad based on what I've heard. We have The Wizard of Oz by Seta. The fact that it's by Seta is concerning for a lot of reasons, but I've heard this is not a great platformer, although I've heard a lot of people also defend this game, so who knows. I'll have to give it a shot at some point. But it was again like a game for $5 that I didn't own, so it was worth it to me just to grab it for the collection so that I can talk about it at some point. And the last thing I grabbed at Goodwill is sort of representative more than anything because I don't have room for the actual thing, but this came in a bundle with it. We have Mario Paint. Except what really mattered was that it came with the mouse. Except not really. It actually did come with the mouse, but it came with the mouse that was attached to a whole new Super Nintendo, because I have a Super Nintendo, but the fact is while I inherited it, I didn't really get to play much of it. Like, I didn't get any games with it, and I didn't have a game for it until I was in high school. It was like the late 2000s. So by the time I did get them, my Super Nintendo actually broke, and it broke in the weirdest way imaginable. Like, you could put any game in there, and it would load them all up, but every single game would crash and break. And they'd crash and break in completely unique ways for each game, but it would be consistent for every single game, and I have no idea how to fix it. I've never had anyone be able to explain what's wrong with it or how to fix it. But I have a couple of Super Nintendo multi-carts that I can't put on my emulation consoles, because I normally play with emulation stuff just because it records and sounds better. But I can't do that with my multi-carts for my multi-cart series, and JetWolf actually sent me a Satellaview Repro cart I've been wanting to review that does not like emulators, period. So I've been trying to run those cartridges off it, and it's been a bit hit or miss. One of my multi-carts doesn't really work all that well. I think it's just a dead multi-cart. And the Satellaview cart works kinda, but you have to do some very specific stuff. Like, you have to create a new character every time you play, and you can only play like the first 1 or 2 difficulty levels, because if you select anything above that, the game just immediately hard locks for some reason. But now I have the means to actually talk about that Satellaview game, and I'm very excited about that, and I can talk about my Super Nintendo multi-carts, which would be a fun little multi-cart venture for us to do. So getting the Super Nintendo, and I got it for a very, very good price. I think I got it for like 40 bucks, was worth it, just so that I could talk about those games. And that was definitely a worthwhile trip to the Goodwill for me. And now, the inevitable question, what is inside the treasure chest of awesome? That is legally distinct from the other one I showed off that I made myself, mainly because this fits the screen better and just looks nicer. We have something I'm very excited to show off. Phantasy Star 4. This was a game I had really wanted to collect. I don't know if I've mentioned this, but I kind of like RPGs, and I kind of want to collect them all for this. In fact, I think I'm only missing 3 or 4 left. Trazia, Sorcerer's Kingdom, Shining in the Darkness, and Phantasy Star 2. And yeah, this was one I really wanted to knock off my list. For those not familiar, Phantasy Star 4 had a lot of custom hardware inside its cartridges, so they were very expensive for the launch. I believe in America they sold for like $100 at the launch, and since then they have kind of maintained that price. In fact, 10 years ago when I started making YouTube videos, it was about this price, and it was sort of colloquially known as sort of the crown jewel of any Genesis collection. And the weird thing is, after all that time, after the huge sort of uptick in Genesis game costs over the past years, this really hasn't been affected at all. It's still sat at about $100, which is basically the average Genesis game cost at this point, which is sad for a lot of reasons. Oh god, I'm never getting Musha or Senti. But this was a game that was highly, highly desirable. I'm a huge fan of Phantasy Star, so I had to get this, of course. But it was a game that just seemed so far out of reach, and to finally get a hold of it, and I've only played the first couple chapters, but man, is it worth it. This is an amazing RPG, definitely one of the best on the system, I'm sure. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful game. It's definitely a step up from the first game of that, Phantasy Star 2, anyway. By a substantial amount, just in visuals and audio. The story it's trying to tell is a lot more interesting and a lot better written, I think. And, oh man, I can see why this is so highly sought after. It's kind of funny that all the other Genesis games have kind of risen up to meet it in price, and this has gone nowhere. But this is definitely a highly sought after Genesis game, and I'm super glad I've got this. It's one of the things that's definitely making my Genesis collection a lot better, I think. I gotta admit, I started this year with about 10 Genesis games, maybe 15, and like maybe 2 of them being any good. And now I'm actually starting to have a Genesis collection I'm pretty proud of. And having this is just the perfect symbolism for that, I think. But yeah, that has been my mostly Genesis collection that I've collected over the summer. Again, if you know Genesis games, tell me I did good, please. I need people to confirm my life choices. But anyway, I hope you have enjoyed, and if you did, you know, subscribe to the show so you can see more stuff that I make, because I make a lot of stuff and it just doesn't seem to get seen by people. I think the algorithm hates me, people hate me, the world hates me, damn it. But you might also want to check out my Twitch stream, because I stream 2 or 3 times every week doing RPGs and other weird stuff that I find. And you might want to help support the show through the PayPal or Patreon. That's certainly appreciated beyond all measure, because that helps me afford games and pay my rent, which I need to do, because my channel does not make all that much money, because again, algorithm seems to hate me. I don't know. Either way, I hope you enjoyed all this, and if you have some awesome stuff you got over the summer, let me know in the comments. And as well as, let me know your cool Genesis games you think I should pick up, other interesting things that might be worth my attention, And hopefully I'll see you next time. But until then, peace out, Internet.